On the 4th of June, 1976, in a small hall in Manchester, a band nobody had heard of played to a crowd of about 40 people. By any normal measure, it was a failure. The room was mostly empty. The band was terrible. The singer later said he couldn't even remember the gig. And almost everyone in that tiny audience went home and started a band. Bands that would go on to reshape music for the next 50 years. This is the story of 1976, the year everything broke. Punk didn't creep in, it detonated. And it happened faster than almost any movement in music history. In 12 months, punk went from a handful of art school misfits in 2 cities to a national moral panic on the front page of every newspaper in Britain. Today, we trace that year. Where the sound actually came from. Where the word came from. The people who lit the fuse. How a torn shirt and a safety pin became a uniform. How that look leaked into high fashion. And how one 2-minute television interview turned a music scene into a national emergency. We're also going to correct some of the legends along the way, because 1976 is a year almost everyone claims they were there for. So how does a scene this small break a country this fast? To understand why 1976 exploded, you have to understand how bad Britain felt in 1976. This was a country in a foul mood. Inflation was brutal, unemployment was climbing, and there was a grinding sense that the future had been canceled, that the optimism of the 60s had curdled into something gray and broke and going nowhere. For a working-class kid leaving school, the prospects were bleak and everybody knew it. And into all that misery, the biggest bands in the country were releasing 20-minute concept albums about wizards, performed by millionaires in capes, on stages the size of aircraft hangars. Rock music had become enormous, technically dazzling, and completely unreachable. Music made by gods, for an audience that was never invited to participate. The distance between the stage and the kid in the crowd had never been wider. But the sound didn't start in Britain. It started in New York, in a filthy club on the Bowery called CBGB, where a scene had been quietly assembling since the early 70s around bands like Television, Patti Smith, and the Ramones. This was punk's real laboratory. Arty, literary, and musically stripped to the bone. And in April of 1976, the Ramones released their debut album. 14 songs, most of them under 2.5 minutes, recorded in about a week for roughly $6,000. No solos, no fat, just bar chords, downstrokes, and speed. It sold poorly in America. It barely scraped the Billboard chart, but it landed in Britain like a grenade. Here's what that record actually did, and it's the thing people miss. It wasn't just that it was fast, it's that it was simple enough to copy. British kids who had spent years believing you needed to be a virtuoso to be in a band picked up that album and realized the truth. You needed 3 chords and enough nerve to stand up. Tony James of Generation X said everybody went up 3 gears the day they got that first Ramones album. That bands had just been playing in an MC5 groove until then. That's a technical observation, but it's really a permission slip. The Ramones didn't teach British punk how to sound. They taught it that it was allowed to start. So by the spring of 1976, the elements were in place. A country in a bad mood. A generation locked out. A record from New York proving the barrier to entry was almost zero. And in London, a clothes shop on the King's Road run by a designer named Vivienne Westwood and a provocateur named Malcolm McLaren, who had assembled a band out of the kids hanging around his store. What happened next didn't unfold over a decade. It unfolded over about 9 months. And it started, of all places, in Manchester, in a half-empty hall, in front of 40 people. So where does the word punk come from? Unlike grunge, this one isn't a mystery. It's just much older and much nastier than people expect. Punk is an Old English word, and for centuries it was purely an insult. It meant a worthless person, a petty criminal, a prostitute. In American prison slang, it carried a specific and degrading sexual meaning. This is not a cool word. This is a word you throw at someone you consider human garbage. The music press in America started attaching it to raw, primitive garage rock in the early 70s. And in 1975, a New York magazine simply called Punk, founded by Legs McNeil and John Holmstrom, helped fix the label onto the CBGB scene. Then, crucially, the kids picked it up and wore it. That's the move that matters. Told you're worthless, you agree loudly, and you turn it into a flag. Now, nobody sat in a room and decided this. The word drifted, got applied by journalists, got argued over, and stuck. Anyone who gives you one clean origin story for punk is tidying up something that was genuinely messy. What's not messy is the meaning. Like grunge after it, punk is a scene that took an insult and made it a badge. Whatever you call it, the people who lit the fuse were about to walk on stage in Manchester. Right. The 4th of June, 1976. Two students from Bolton, Howard Devoto and Pete Shelley, had read a review of the Sex Pistols in the NME, a piece where guitarist Steve Jones announced, "Actually, we're not into music, we're into chaos." They drove to London to see this band. They came back converted. So they hired Manchester's lesser free trade hall for £32, advertised it in the local paper, and sold tickets for 50 pence. Their own band, the Buzzcocks, was supposed to open, but they couldn't find a bass player in time. So the Sex Pistols played their first ever gig outside London to a crowd estimated at somewhere between 30 and 50 people. And this is where it stops being a gig and becomes a legend, because of who was standing in that room. In an audience of maybe 40 people were Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, who would form Joy Division and then New Order; Morrissey, who would form the Smiths; Mark E. Smith, who would form The Fall; Mick Hucknall, who would form Simply Red; Martin Hannett and Tony Wilson, who would build Factory Records and change how records got made and sold in Britain; and Devoto and Shelley themselves, who'd go on to Buzzcocks and Magazine. Almost the entire future of Manchester music, and arguably the entire future of British independent music, was standing in one small, mostly empty room, watching a shambolic band they'd never heard of. The NME later called it the most important concert of all time. And the reason isn't that the Pistols were good. By most accounts, they were a mess, and Johnny Rotten said he couldn't remember the show at all. The reason is that they were beatable. Everyone in that room watched four kids who couldn't really play, being confrontational and loud and getting away with it, and thought, I could do that. I could do that better. That's the whole mechanism of punk in one sentence. Now, the honest note. Attendance at this gig is one of the great lies in British music. Hundreds of people have claimed they were there. The room held a few dozen. There's even a documentary about it called I Swear I Was There, which tells you everything. When something becomes important, history gets crowded retroactively. Meanwhile, in London, the engine had a very specific design. Malcolm McLaren, a manager who'd briefly handled the New York Dolls and come home with ideas, had assembled the Sex Pistols largely from kids orbiting the clothes shop he ran with Vivienne Westwood. He recruited a singer, John Lydon, rechristened Johnny Rotten, reportedly on the strength of him miming to a jukebox in the shop with total sneering contempt. That's the band's origin. A shop, a provocateur, and a kid with a talent for hostility. And it's worth saying plainly because punk mythology tends to sand this off. The Sex Pistols were, in significant part, a managed project. That doesn't make them fake. But the most anti-establishment band in Britain was steered by a man who understood publicity the way a chess player understands an endgame. That tension runs through this entire story. So, what was the belief system? Strip away the safety pins and the shouting, and punk's core idea is startlingly simple and genuinely radical. You do not need permission. You don't need a record label, a music degree, an expensive guitar, or a producer's approval. You need 3 chords and the will to do it. That's the whole thesis. Punk didn't just tolerate amateurism, it demanded it. Being unable to play properly wasn't an obstacle to overcome. It was proof you were the real thing. That idea got its perfect expression a few months later, in January 1977, in a fanzine called Sideburns. 3 badly drawn guitar chords, and printed underneath them, This is a chord, this is another, this is a third. Now form a band. It is probably the most famous sentence punk ever produced, and almost everyone credits it to the wrong magazine. Ask around and people will tell you it came from Sniffin' Glue, the best-known punk zine of the era. It didn't. Mark Perry, who actually edited Sniffin' Glue, has spent decades correcting people about it. He once said it's so mythical now, but it never was, and that he's had to put so many people right. The drawing was by a man called Tony Moon, and by his own account, he only scribbled it in to fill up an empty space on the page. The most quoted statement of punk's entire philosophy was filler. And that idea was far more dangerous to the music industry than any swear word, because it collapsed the entire hierarchy the industry was built on. If anyone could form a band, anyone could press a record. If anyone could press a record, you didn't need EMI. Punk's real legacy isn't a sound at all. It's the independent label, the self-released single, the fanzine, the network of people doing it themselves outside the official system. Everything from indie rock to hardcore to hip-hop's mixtape economy to a kid uploading a track from a bedroom today runs on the principle punk made explicit in 1976. You are allowed to just do it. And around the bands grew a scene of people who dressed the part before there was a part to dress. In London, a cluster of Pistols fans became known as the Bromley Contingent, a name coined by the journalist Caroline Coon. Remember her because she comes back into this story later. Suburban kids who followed the band everywhere and dressed to terrify their neighbors. Among them was a young woman named Susan Ballion, who would rename herself Susie Sue, and a young man named William Broad, who would rename himself Billy Idol. These weren't musicians at first. They were audience. Kids who understood instinctively that punk was a costume you could put on and a self you could invent. And notice the renaming, because it's the whole thing in one gesture. John Lydon becomes Johnny Rotten. Susan Ballion becomes Susie Sue. William Broad becomes Billy Idol. Simon Ritchie becomes Sid Vicious. You didn't just join a scene. You killed off the person your parents named and built a new one. That's what punk actually offered the outcasts of a gray, broke country. Not just music, but a total identity, available immediately, free of charge. New name, new clothes, new posture, new way of speaking. You didn't need money or talent or connections. You needed nerve. And for a teenager with no prospects in 1976 Britain, being able to walk down the street and make respectable adults visibly uncomfortable was an intoxicating amount of power for someone who otherwise had none. It worked in both directions, though. The same look that gave you a tribe also made you a target. Punks got beaten up, refused service, thrown out of pubs. The uniform was a badge and a bullseye at the same time. Which, if you were 16 and furious and nobody had ever taken you seriously before, only made it feel more real. Now the clothes. And punk is unusual here because punk's look wasn't an accident. It was designed. In a shop. On purpose. Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren's boutique on the King's Road went through several names, and by 1976, it was called Sex. It was arguably as important to punk as any record. This was where the visual language was engineered. Torn fabric, bondage straps, deliberately offensive slogans, safety pins holding things together. Westwood was a serious designer making a serious argument, and the argument was confrontation. Clothing as an act of aggression against a polite country. Read what that outfit is saying, because it's precise. Ripped clothing in a country obsessed with respectability. I reject your standards. Safety pins, the cheapest possible object, holding together something broken. I am not going to hide that things are broken. Bondage gear worn on a Tuesday afternoon on a public street. Your comfort is not my problem. Slogans designed to get you punched. This wasn't decoration. This was a weapon you could wear. And unlike almost every scene we cover on this channel, the look didn't follow the music. In punk, the look and the music arrived together, from the same shop, engineered by the same two people. Which is why punk's visual identity was fully formed almost from day one. It had been designed before the first chord was played. Grunge's uniform was an accident of poverty. Punk's was a manifesto with a price tag. It also went to places that were genuinely indefensible, and it would be dishonest to skip past it. A handful of scenesters wore swastikas. Not in most cases from conviction, but as the ultimate available shock object in a country where the war was still living memory and your parents had fought in it. It was designed to be the most offensive thing a British teenager could put on their chest. And it was stupid, and it was cruel to people who had actually suffered, and it gave punk's enemies exactly the weapon they wanted. The people in the scene who were serious about politics spent years cleaning up after it. Which brings us to the great punk irony. Vivienne Westwood, the woman who put bondage trousers on the King's Road to horrify Britain, became one of the most celebrated fashion designers in the world. A dame of the British Empire. The aesthetic she built to attack the establishment was absorbed by that establishment so completely that safety pins and tartan and deliberate distress have been recycled on luxury runways for 50 years, at prices that would have bought a punk's entire wardrobe several hundred times over. Every few seasons, high fashion rediscovers punk, sells rips and pins at a markup, and calls it edgy. And you know this pattern by now because it's the story this channel keeps telling. A subculture builds a look to say, we are not you. The mainstream, starving for an authenticity it can't manufacture, takes the look and leaves the meaning behind. The tear gets stitched in at the factory. The safety pin becomes a brooch. What was a genuine act of hostility becomes a texture. Punk just happens to be the most repeated example, because its visual language was so strong and so simple that it can be copied endlessly by people who want to look dangerous without being it. By September, punk was ready to be seen. The 100 Club on Oxford Street hosted a 2-day punk festival. The Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Damned, Susie, and The Banshees, playing to a room that held about 600 people. Susie's set was pure improvisation. Her band didn't know any songs, so she recited the Lord's Prayer over noise for 20 minutes. And then it went wrong. During the Damned set, a glass was thrown, shattered against a pillar, and a young woman was badly injured. Sid Vicious was arrested for it. Here is where I have to be careful, because this is genuinely contested. Caroline Coon, the same journalist who named the Bromley contingent, was standing beside Sid that night, and she insisted, then and afterwards, that he threw nothing at all. The venue's promoter later denied Sid was solely responsible. Accounts even differ on how badly the woman was hurt. What's certain is that a real person was seriously injured, that Sid was blamed, and that the press had exactly the story it wanted. Then came the 1st of December and one of the strangest accidents in music history. Queen were booked to appear on a London tea-time television show called Today. Freddie Mercury had a toothache. He canceled to visit the dentist. Their record label, EMI, scrambled for a replacement and offered up another band on its books, the Sex Pistols. The host, Bill Grundy, opened by remarking they seemed as drunk as he was. He needled them about money. He made a clumsy pass at Susie Sue. And then, fatally, he dared Steve Jones to say something outrageous. Jones obliged. He called Grundy a dirty bastard and a dirty fucker on live British television at tea time in front of families. The next morning, the Daily Mirror ran the front page that made punk a household word. The filth and the fury. Every tabloid in the country put the Sex Pistols on the front page. The switchboard at the TV station jammed. And because unanswered calls were rerouted, the band ended up personally answering the phones to the furious viewers they'd just offended. One man reportedly claimed he'd kicked in his own television. Bill Grundy was suspended, his show was canceled within weeks, and his career never recovered. And punk, a scene that in June had played to 40 people in Manchester, was now, in December, a national emergency. Councils banned the gigs. EMI dropped the band. Most of their tour was canceled. So what did 1976 do? Two things at once, and their intention. It handed a generation of powerless young people a genuine weapon. The idea that you can make culture yourself, refuse the gatekeepers, and be heard. That idea escaped punk immediately and never stopped spreading. But it also gave the tabloids a monster, and the scene paid for that. The confrontational shell that made punk exciting also attracted people who just wanted an excuse for violence. and the gigs got harder and uglier as the year closed. The freedom and the poison came through the same door. That's not a flaw in the story. That is the story. You cannot build a movement on the principle that nothing is off limits and then act surprised when some people take you at your word. Punk as a mainstream force burned out almost immediately. By the start of 1978, the Sex Pistols had disintegrated on a disastrous American tour. Rotten walked off stage asking the crowd if they'd ever felt like they'd been cheated, and Sid Vicious would be dead within a year of that. As a sound, punk was a brief, bright flare. A couple of years, and then it fractured into a dozen things. But that's the wrong way to measure it, because as an idea, it never stopped. Look at what came directly out of that fracture. Post-punk, which took the freedom and made it strange and beautiful. Joy Division, formed by two men who were standing in that Manchester room. Hardcore, which took the aggression and made it faster. Indie, which took the DIY principle and built an entire parallel industry on it. Factory Records, founded by Tony Wilson, who was also standing in that Manchester room. Riot Girl. Grunge, whose whole authenticity code is punk's ethic with the volume turned down. And ultimately, every kid with a laptop uploading a song tonight without asking anyone's permission. Punk lost the war and won the century. The bands died. The movement collapsed into self-parody within about 18 months. The clothes ended up on a luxury runway. But the idea got out into the world and never went back in the box. The idea that you are allowed to make something without being qualified, without being invited, without being any good yet. Remember where we started. A small hall in Manchester. About 40 people. A band that couldn't really play, on a night that by every normal measure was a failure. That's the whole thing right there. Punk's genius was never musical. It was the discovery that being unqualified is not a reason to stay silent. That a half-empty room can change more than a stadium if the right 40 people are standing in it. And every single one of them went home and picked up a guitar. 1976 wasn't punk's peak. It was punk's breaking point. The year the dam went, and everything downstream got rewritten. If you made it all the way here, you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And tell me in the comments, which punk band or figure did I leave out that deserved their own chapter? I read them all. Get down there and make your case. Next time on Tape Hiss, we leave the noise behind and head to a bankrupt city in the American Midwest, where a handful of teenagers found a machine nobody wanted. A machine that cost about $100, and they used it to invent the sound of the future. Until then, keep listening to the hiss.